Okay, so recovery plans. So, once a species is listed as endangered, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is required to propose a recovery plan. This details the rebuilding of the species to sustainable levels. This can take years, it is expensive, and unfortunately, it is interfered with politically due to economic interests. And the issue is also once a species is endangered, much of its habitat and ability to survive is often compromised to begin with. So, the recovery plan will detail how populations will be stabilized or rebuilt to sustainable levels. A recovery plan could include many different types of strategies. You could buy habitat areas, you can restore habitat, you can reintroduce it, you can have captive breeding programs, you can even negotiate with landowners to do things to help a species out. Now, some endangered species might merit special attention over others. For example, keystone species have major effects on other members of the community more than you would think. Things like bison. Indicator species are tied to specific communities and successional stages, an example being brook trout. Umbrella species actually require large blocks of undisturbed habitat, like the northern spotted owl, and this actually can help other species then because by creating undisturbed habitat for that species, your species of interest, it provides protection for other unintended species. You can also have flagship species. These are attractive organisms that people react to emotionally, things like the giant panda. Now, when you look at successful recovery plans, this will include things like the bald eagle, peregrine falcons, and honestly, the books I looked at list the whooping crane. The whooping crane is not that successful yet. It's still not where it needs to be, but eagles, falcons, and honestly, I would say pelicans have done pretty well too. Now, opponents to recovery plans try to require economic costs and benefits be incorporated into planning. So in 1978, there was a dam in Tennessee that threatened a fish called the snail darter. And a federal committee was given power to override the Endangered Species Act for economic reasons. And unfortunately, you can have economic interests in conflict. So when you look at commercial and sport fishing for salmon, it's worth $1 billion per year. But farmers and electric utilities on the Columbia want dams for irrigation and hydroelectric power. Whose money is worth more? Now, 80% of habitat for more than half of all listed species is on non-public property. And the Supreme Court has ruled that destroying habitat for endangered species is the same as taking the animals. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been negotiating habitat conservation plans with private landowners. Basically, they're allowed to harvest resources or build on part of the land as long as whatever they're doing is benefiting the endangered species. Now, the ESA is controversial. It officially expired in 1992, and some people see it as the government's way to take away private property and trample on individual rights. When you look at farmers, loggers, miners, ranchers, and developers, they try to prevent it being reauthorized. Also, some scientists and conservationists have been critical of it because the focus should be on continent-wide preservation of ecosystems and supporting maximum biodiversity rather than focusing on a few individual species with public interest. Now, it has seen some success, right? It's held off the extinction of hundreds of species. Some have recovered. Again, pelicans, peregrines, the eagle, alligators. However, political and legal debates can drag on for years. Again, the snail darter. There are so many fights over the snail darter. The timber industry fought over the spotted owl for over a decade. Now, in other countries, Canada has a committee on the status of endangered wildlife in Canada. The ruling in 1977 establishes rules for listing and protecting endangered species. You have the European Union's Bird Directive and Habitat Directive. Australia has an Endangered Species Protection Act. There's an International Convention on Biological Diversity. And there's CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. So when you look at CITES in 1975, it regulates the trade in living specimens and products derived from listed species. And currently it has 700 species that are threatened with extinction from international trade. Now, habitat protection overall might be a better focus than species protection. So lots of scientists, managers, policymakers are arguing that we need to look at continent-wide preservation, because by supporting large ecosystems, you're supporting maximum biological diversity. This is more effective than doing a species by species battle for things that are going extinct. So one thing you can do is look at gap analysis. So gap analysis is you're looking for unprotected landscapes that are rich in species. So this picture here is showing biodiversity on the island of Hawaii. You see where high species richness are, and these are areas that are not protected. And you have these preserves that are scenic, but they don't actually protect species. So why not create preserves where you have, scenic and recreational value, but you also have species protection? Now, the conservation biologist Grumbine suggests 4 principles for protecting biodiversity in a large-scale, long-range approach. So you want to protect enough habitat so that it's viable for all native species in a given region. You want to manage at a regional scale large enough to accommodate natural disturbances. You want to plan over a period of centuries for the evolution of the ecosystem. So you need to think long-term, not short-term. And you need to allow for human use at a level that will not result in ecological degradation. So how can humans use this resource, but in a way that's not going to damage it? We also have captive breeding programs. So captive breeding in zoos and botanical gardens are one way to try to save threatened species. They can be repositories of genetic diversity. So if you look at most mammals in North American zoos, they're actually coming from captive breeding programs, and they do provide animals for reintroduction programs back into the wild. The problem is not all species are able to reproduce in captivity yet, and there are not enough zoos and space in zoos to maintain every species, and to maintain every species with enough genetic diversity to make it viable in the long term. What are some issues? Well, zoos have limited space, right? How many species should we save? How many can we save? Do we save diseases? Should we save parasites? Again, there's limited genetic diversity in zoos, so there's inbreeding. That can eventually lead to infertility and low infant survival. And while we're busy trying to breed animals in zoos, their natural habitat's disappearing anyway. It's not like we can reintroduce them unless we save the habitat too. So an alternative is to attempt to save species in the wild. You provide funding to catch poachers and protect species in their native habitats. Now, when you look at world forests, they cover 29% of the world's land surface. Grasslands cover about 29% of the land. The rest of the forests are in tropical and boreal regions. So forests and grasslands provide a lot of essential resources like lumber, paper pulp, and livestock grazing. They also provide a lot of environmental services. They do have scenic, cultural, and historic value. So a forest, by definition, is any area where trees cover more than 10% of the land. And the largest remaining forests are found in cold, high-latitude areas and at human equatorial areas. So this definition of a forest actually ranges from savannas, where trees cover less than 20% of the land in places like Africa, to closed canopy forests, where trees actually overlap each other to cover most of the ground. So if you look at where the majority of the forests are, they're at the equator, and they're in the north, basically. That's where the majority of forests exist currently. And the largest tropical forests are in South America. This is where about 22% of the world's forests And it's the largest undisturbed tropical rainforest, although we're getting really good at disturbing it at this point. When you look at North America and Eurasia, they have vast areas of unaltered boreal forests. Now, when you're talking about primary forests or old-growth forests, these are composed primarily of native species. There is very little indication of human activity, and ecological processes have not been disturbed by humans. This is also an area that's home to a lot of the world's biodiversity, ecological services, and you have a lot of indigenous human cultures that still exist there. When you look at primary forests, one third of the world's forests are primary forests, and about 6 million hectares of these are being cleared or damaged each year. And when you look at countries that are logging, 9 out of 10 of the countries where 80% of these forests exists, they are logging at unsustainable rates. So we'll pick up with forest harvest methods in the next video.